Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, the self-proclaimed insurgent outsider president vilifying his opponent as a pillar of the Washington establishment. But his rival, the former vice president, hits right back, presenting himself as the anti-Trump candidate come to save America from its worst nightmare. The first televised debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden ahead of the US presidential election has been scrappy, acrimonious, chaotic, and full of destructive energy. A debate that will be talked about for decades. We have reaction and analysis. And later, as Nigeria prepares to mark 60 years of independence, several aspects of the country's penal system remain antiquated, with many countries changing their thinking from the retributive mode of incarceration to a more restorative model of justice. We ask, is it time for Nigeria to adopt a victim-centered approach which challenges the person who caused the harm to engage in acts that make things right? We'll speak to a UN expert on restorative justice coming up. Now, tens of millions of people in the United States and around the world have tuned in to watch the long-awaited battle between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. It was their first televised presidential debate in Cleveland, Ohio, and it was a series of acrimonious and chaotic exchanges. The two candidates traded insults and clashed over virtually every topic, but especially on such issues as healthcare, the coronavirus, and systemic racism. The debate's moderator, the Fox News anchor Chris Wallace, had his hands full as the two gladiators interrupted one another repeatedly amid many, many angry exchanges.
Are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you
I'm
prepared
to
specifically
do it?
Well, go ahead, sir.
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it.
Do you want to call him? What do you want to call him? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
Who would
white
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem. This is a left-wing. This is a left-wing problem. This is radical left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe? Who's on your list?
Right. Gentlemen, I think
this
we've
is
ended
so
this.
He's going to pack the court.
We have
not going to give a list.
We have ended this segment. We're going to move on to the second segment.
That was really, here's the deal. The fact is that everything he's saying so far is simply a lie. I'm not here to call out his lies. Everybody knows he's a liar.
But you
I just want to make sure.
Joe, you're the liar.
Joe Biden and Donald Trump there. Well, for his assessment of how the debate went, I'm joined now via Cisco WebEx by a senior member of the US Democratic Party, Bill Barnard. Bill, thank you very much indeed for joining us. You've had, I understand, a long career as a member of the Democratic Party. Have you ever seen anything like what you saw last night?
Absolutely not. It was not exactly an edifying example of American politics at its best, or even it was beyond belief, quite frankly. I mean, it was very clear that the president came determined to disrupt matters from the very outset, from the very first question, the very first words uttered out of his mouth, and to try to put Biden on the back foot and to force him into some kind of a gaffe or whatever. It didn't work. It did work to destroy any purpose of that so-called debate. I did have some sympathy for the moderator. He clearly lost control, again, almost from the beginning of the process. But it would have been almost impossible for anyone to rein things in, given the determination of the president to act as he did.
And there was some suggestion, Bill, that Mr. Trump managed to portray himself as the top dog in the yard, and that was to the detriment of Joe Biden.
I think it's to the detriment of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the one who needed to change the momentum of this election coming out of the debate. He's behind in the national polls, significantly behind, far further behind than Hillary Clinton was. He's behind in the swing states as well in the most recent polling. So he had to change the momentum, and he failed to do that. He needs somehow or another to reestablish contact with and support from particularly white suburbanites, but also other groups as well. And the way in which he conducted himself is the very thing that has alienated so many of those voters from him. So he comes out, I think, in a weakened position from this debate.
But then I suppose that the question is, did Mr. Trump stop Joe Biden talking about the things presumably he wanted to talk about, which is the issues, and to go after Mr. Trump on his record as the incumbent?
Neither one of them was able to address issues in any great depth, in part because, again, of the disruptive tactics that Trump followed. I don't think Biden had a stellar night. I don't think that was true, but he certainly held his own. I think his supporters will be glad to see that he pushed back sometimes, even though he went beyond over the top on some of the comments that he made about Trump. But on the other hand, the reaction to Trump is going to be so strong it's going to hurt him, and we'll see that in the polls over the next week.
So just to be clear, I mean, expectedly, I mean, you're a Democrat. If he didn't manage to throw Mr. Biden off balance, and largely Mr. Biden seemed to keep his cool, did he therefore fail? Because he may have managed to appeal to his core supporters, but he may also have alienated many people.
I think that's exactly on point. He will have delighted his core support, but his core support is not enough. He's got somehow to expand that base, and he hasn't been able to do it thus far, and he certainly wasn't able to do it last night by the way he acted and the way he behaved. Now, the next debate, quote unquote, is of a different format. It's a town hall where there will be citizens asking the question, and they'll be directed directly to one of the two participants with some comments, I presume, by the other. So it'll be a little more difficult for Trump to pursue the tactic that he did this time.
So tell me if you agree, Bill, with this assessment as a voter yourself, and although you're a Democrat, somebody who is also reasonably objective American. I mean, chaotic, combative, full of sound and fury, and almost, let's face it, impossible to watch, with the president going on a relentless attack on Joe Biden, and eventually Mr. Biden not following the rules either and going after the president.
I think that in large measure is true. It was very clear who was the moving force in this, who had decided the tactic to take from the very outset, and that was President Trump. And I don't think he did himself any favors by doing that. Joe Biden may not have knocked it out of the park, but he didn't lose the debate in the way that Donald Trump did.
And I suppose the critical question, and I imagine that's a question that's being asked in Democratic circles, is at the end of it all, whose mind will it have changed amongst the small sliver of the country? I understand 6 to 10%, the polls suggest, who haven't made up their minds.
Well, I think that's true of this election, in fact, more than almost any others. The small number of undecided votes at this point is smaller than I can remember in any election in my lifetime, at least that we have good polling data for. It is true that it is often said that debates do not change the momentum of an election. And except for the 1960s debate between Kennedy and Nixon, I think that's probably true. This one could have, if Trump had been able to push Biden into a real gaffe, a real serious mistake or whatever, it could have made a difference for him, but he didn't do it. So I doubt that the small number of people who were on the fence found last night very edifying or very helpful in choosing a person to vote for. Some of the immediate polls done after the debate and some of the focus groups tended to indicate that Biden was perceived to have done significantly better than Trump. But I don't think for most people who are undecided, the small number who are, I'm not sure that last night was particularly helpful.
There was that moment, wasn't there, that stood out about Joe Biden's son, who is dead, and the president seemed to jump in and talk about Hunter Biden, the other Joe Biden's son, who is alive, in a way that seemed rather insensitive. I would imagine that would rub particularly a lot of women up the wrong way.
Personal level, on a character level, that was very telling. Joe Biden was in the process of saying that he rejected Trump's description of American troops as suckers and losers, including those who've lost their life in World War II and in other subsequent wars. And then Trump immediately jumps on Hunter Biden, who, as Joe Biden pointed out, has had problems, as many people have members of their family who've had problems with drugs, for example, which he's successfully dealt with pretty much thus far. I think it was insensitive, and I think most people would have cringed at that kind of behavior from a president of the United States.
Well, nevertheless, I mean, I expect that Mr. Trump's loyal base of supporters would have absolutely loved the way he took the fight to Joe Biden. But for the Democrats and for you, you know, I imagine most of you were probably pretty nervous going into this, worrying that Joe Biden would stumble and would seem frail and would somehow not be up to the job. I mean, have you been reassured that Mr. Biden managed to stand his ground?
You know, Trump did Biden a great favor by setting expectations so low. Simply by showing up and persevering through the whole event, Biden would certainly pass the bar that Trump had originally set up. In the last few days before the debate, he tried to change his tactics and say that Biden was an experienced debater and that he was good. And if you look back at some of his debates, particularly with Vice Presidential candidate Ryan in 2016, I guess it was, 2012, you can see that he is and can be a formidable debater. It was hard to show that last night, given the way that Trump behaved. But I think Biden, in the end, showed he persevered, showed that he stuck to his points. He got riled a couple of times and said a few things that those of us who would like a little more civility in our politics probably would like not to have said. But as one commentator this morning commented, that generally they reject the idea of personal attacks and name-calling and all the rest, but this time it seemed perfectly justified.
Well, I suppose what we've got to do now is look forward to the next debate. I want to thank you very much indeed, Bill.
Sure.
Bill Barnard is a senior member of the US Democratic Party talking to me there. And you're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our analysis of the first televised debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Almost unwatchable. The first presidential debate of the current US election campaign has received some pretty damning reviews. Donald Trump and Joe Biden disagreed on everything from COVID-19 to racial tension, and even whether to respect the outcome of the vote in November. But it was the angry tone which disappointed most observers, with the president interrupting a whopping 73 times and both men exchanging a torrent of insults.
I'll tell you, Joe, you could never have done the job that we did. You don't have it in your blood. You could have never done that job.
I know how to do the job. I know how to get the job
Well, you
done.
didn't do very well in swine flu. H1N1, you were a disaster. Your own chief of staff said you were a disaster.
14,000 people died, not 200,000. There was no economic recession.
Sir, you made a
there was no recession.
You made a point. Let him answer.
And there was we didn't shut down the economy. This is his economy he's shut down. The reason it's shut down is because, look, you folks at home, how many of you got up this morning and had an empty chair at the kitchen table because someone died of COVID? How many of you were in a situation where you lost your mom or dad and you couldn't even speak to them? You had a nurse holding a phone up so you could, in fact, say goodbye.
You would have lost far
How
more
many
people. Far more people. Well, I've spoken to the companies, and we can have it a lot sooner. It's a very political thing because people like this would rather make it political than save lives.
God.
It is a very political thing. I've spoken to Pfizer. I've spoken to all of the people that you have to speak to. We have great Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and others. They can go faster than that by a lot. Become very political because the left, or I don't know if I call them left, I don't know what I call them.
So you're suggesting that the head of your Operation Warp Speed, Dr. Smiley?
I disagree with him. Yeah, no, I disagree with both of them. And he didn't say that. He said it could be there, but it could also be much sooner. I had him in my office 2 days. It's all set up.
By Easter, this would be gone away. By the warm weather, it'd be gone. Miraculous, like a miracle. And by the way, maybe you could inject some bleach in your arm, and that would take care of it.
Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Well, one man who's familiar with presidential debates is the former Nigerian presidential candidate, Professor Kingsley Moghalu, who ran for office in 2019 and was unanimously declared the winner of the presidential debate that took place in that year. Dr. Moghalu is also a political economist, lawyer, and former deputy governor of the Nigerian Central Bank, and he joins me now from Washington. Dr. Moghalu, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I spoke to you yesterday, and I know you were getting ready, even as we spoke, to plant yourself in front of the television set and your notepad out to make notes. Watching that ferociously combative debate, what did you make of it all?
I expected fireworks. I expected a strong debate, but I did not expect the debacle that took place last night. I think it was an embarrassment to the United States, which holds itself out to the world as a beacon of democracy. So I was very disappointed with the tone of the debate, and I felt sorry that the moderator could not control it. I think very clearly, like your previous guest said, President Trump came to the debate with a strategy or a tactic that is not surprising. He actually has used it previously several times, frequently interrupting his opponent, trying to talk over him, but it was just, excessive. And even many Republicans admitted that. And of course, that now made Mr. Biden to feel that he shouldn't look too weak. And therefore, he hurled an insult or two at the President of the United States. And in one very memorable instance, calling him, quote unquote, a clown. So what am I to say? When the President of the United States is being addressed as a clown by a political opponent. So I think American democracy in this election cycle has really come down very low. But this is also partly because of choices that the American people themselves have made. It wasn't forced on them. And I think the lesson for all of us is that democracy is only as good as those who are participating in it, and the institutions are only as good as those who run it.
That's an interesting point. But I mean, just looking, you took part in a presidential debate last year in Nigeria that was watched by millions of people across Nigeria and across the subcontinent. I mean, how does that compare to what you saw last night?
Well, I think, compared to what happened last night, our debate was quite civil. Every participant in the debate was disciplined to a very large extent. I don't recall any one of the participants behaving in a way that, viewers of the debate condemned. So I think it was a much better debate that we have. One of the problems of the debate, of course, was that two candidates of the two leading political parties chose not to participate in it, and yet got rewarded with most of the votes in the election. So I think that speaks to how disempowered Nigerians are in their democracy, that candidates who are seeking their votes opt out of presenting their record and their vision, and yet they go and vote for some of those people. So it shows how the people regard themselves vis-a-vis the politicians. And I think that was quite interesting. But for those of us who participated, it was a wonderful exercise, I think. And I recall that many people who voted for me said specifically that they were swayed by what they considered their assessment of my performance in the debate. And that was very encouraging because it kind of began to set a new standard, which I hope future elections will uphold.
Well, we certainly hope so, don't we? And just going back to the American presidential debate, which moments really stood out for you? I mean, did either Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump manage to land any of those proverbial punches?
I think that President Trump opened actually very well when he spoke in response to the question on the Supreme Court. Why are you nominating a justice of the Supreme Court when the elections are already underway? I want you to bear in mind that over 1 million people have already voted in the United States, voting by mail. Some are voting early already in person. So, but I thought Mr. Trump's response to that question was actually very good when he said that elections have consequences. They won the presidency, they control the Senate. And so the Constitution gives him the right to nominate, and he has 4 years as a term of office. Now, a lot of people would disagree with that because in 2016, 9 months before the election, President Obama nominated a judge for the Supreme Court. And the Republicans who controlled the Senate, at that time, refused to give the nominee a hearing because they said it's an election year. So, of course, there's quite a lot of hypocrisy here and quite a lot of double standards. But nevertheless, I thought Mr. Trump made a good case for himself on that. But the whole debate went downhill shortly thereafter. On the part of Mr. Biden, I thought he was able, despite the pressure he was under from Mr. Trump, despite all the constant interruptions, it is superhuman to be able to hold your own in such a circumstance. But Mr. Biden did rather well, and from time to time, he would speak into the camera, addressing the American people on some of the core issues on his agenda and his manifesto, such as healthcare, such as the coronavirus, and very memorably, his closing about the validity or the integrity of the election, when he told Americans, don't listen to anything Mr. Trump is saying, go out and vote. The vote is in your hands. You will determine the outcome. If I win, he will have to go. If I lose, that's okay. So I thought that was a very high moment in his own presentation. So, Mr. Biden had a number of strong points. I thought Mr. Trump had one strong point at the beginning.
Just briefly, because we're almost out of time, we've got less than a minute. On the whole, there's been a lot of talk about untruths expressed by both sides. Who do you think was far less truthful of the two men, Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump?
Well, I mean, I'm speaking very objectively. I'm not a partisan in this election. But I think it is known from American media's fact-checking that Mr. Trump frequently makes statements that do not stand up to an assessment of the facts. And I think that again happened last night. Biden occasionally does the same thing, but on a weighted scale, that kind of falls more on Mr. Trump's side from everything that goes on in America, from what we can see.
Dr. Kingsley Moghalu, we really appreciate your taking the time on a busy day for you to talk to us from Washington, D.C. Kingsley Moghalu, the former Nigerian presidential candidate. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our analysis of that fractious U.S. presidential debate. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolu. So Donald Trump and Joe Biden go head-to-head in their first televised election presidential debate, and civilized it is not. The rivals traded bitter personal insults in an acrimonious contest, frequently talking over each other and trying to score hits over the coronavirus pandemic, the economy, race, crime and climate change. Correspondents say undecided voters would have learnt little to sway them either way.
Now that millions of mail-in ballots have gone out, what are you going to do about it? And are you counting on the Supreme Court, including a Justice Barrett, to settle any dispute?
No one has established at all that there is fraud related to mail-in ballots, that somehow it's a fraudulent process.
It's already been established. Take a look at Carolyn Maloney's race.
I asked you had an opportunity to respond.
Carolyn
Go ahead.
They have no idea what
Vice
happened.
President Biden, go ahead.
He has no idea what he's talking about. Here's the deal. The fact is, I will accept it, and he will too. You know why? Because once the winner is declared, after all the ballots are counted, all the votes are counted, that'll be the end of it. That'll be the end of it. And if it's me, in fact, fine. If it's not me, I'll support the outcome. And I'll be a president not just for the Democrats, I'll be a president for Democrats and Republicans.
Joe Biden and Donald Trump there. Well, for his analysis of that fractious presidential debate, I'm joined now by Arise special correspondent Karl Bostic. Good to see you, Karl. Long night for you, of course, but is it fair to say that this was possibly the angriest presidential debate in American history, and Mr. Trump was at one point called out by the moderator for not sticking to the rules?
More than that, Charles, I would say it's actually maybe historic, maybe the worst ever. When you look at the reactions and you look at the responses, and actually what was running through my mind, I was personally thinking, I don't know if the country can put up with 4 more years of conduct like this, especially if these life-threatening crises are not solved. I mean, let's just go quickly through some of the reactions and responses we saw in the media. We have some of the headlines to show you, Charles, if you can see them. And we can see that the Political Wire is saying the worst presidential debate ever. New York Times is saying Trump was hectoring him. And then the Political said an epic moment of national shame. The debate was an embarrassment for the ages, Charles. That's what Politico was saying. And then the Washington Post was saying Trump plunges debate into fiery squabbling. We also have some comments, from some of these, media columnists as well in our next bit of tape. And of course, this is the Huffington Post saying raging bull, lying, cheating, barking, bullying, debacle, Charles. And some of the comments, and we can also show you some of those comments, Charles, which are pretty scathing by very esteemed people. From the Washington Post, no one alive has ever seen a presidential debate like Tuesday night's unseemly shout fest. 90 minutes of invective interruptions and personal insults. It was an insult to the public, as well as a sad example of the state of American democracy 5 weeks before the election. Another one saying, Charles, another comment that we have coming up, saying that those who did persist in watching were rewarded in a perverse way because it was really painful to watch, Charles. They witnessed history in the making. The proceeding was an epic spectacle, a new low in presidential politics, a new high watermark in national shame. And finally, one final one from a focus group that Politico talked to. This is another commentator saying he's old enough to have watched every debate since John F. Kennedy, and he had never seen such a gutter snipe bully boy performance ever in all of his years. And finally, there was a comment from someone in a focus group who was an undecided voter. We have her comment, Charles, if we have that graphic up. Sorry, we don't have that comment up, but nonetheless, she was saying it was like, someone talking to someone who was on drugs. That sort of a comment. But Charles, people are just so shell-shocked by this. They're trying to make sense of, whether they can put up with this in the coming weeks.
To be honest with you, I stayed up. last night, and I stayed up and I watched the entire debate. I mean, it was really quite extraordinary, but I have to say it was also riveting to watch these two men go at it. And there was this very interesting exchange, wasn't there, about the coming election and the ballots, and the president suggesting rather ominously that this wasn't going to end well and that the Supreme Court would have to look at the result of the election.
Actually, there were probably two chilling takeaways, Charles, in this, and you just touched on one of them. That first takeaway that you just mentioned, he was suggesting that we may not know the results on election night, that's November 3rd, that because of so many people voting by mail-in ballot because of the coronavirus pandemic, it could be open to fraud, even though statistics show and evidence shows that it's pretty much baseless. But this is someone who's not speaking as though he wants to win at the ballot box. It's like whatever he can do to disrupt the counting. And that's why he says, well, this will probably have to go to the Supreme Court. So he's setting the stage for that, Charles. But he also honestly said, when he was asked to, for once and for all, to denounce white supremacy, he didn't. He waffled. When Proud Boys was mentioned, he simply said, stand back and stand by, as they'll be ready for the call to order. And they took that as an endorsement. So, Charles, I think if anything, the way this debate was handled, it also called into question whether or not it's even wise to consider two more debates like this. We have some response from some of the critics who talked about the wisdom of having two more debates in this same format. And so we see here Politico saying Biden campaign is worried about they should have this. New York Times is saying Biden should refuse to debate Trump again. So even though you and the colleague you spoke with talked about two more debates, I think if we do see two more debates, we may see some changes. They're talking about maybe cutting the mic if someone is interrupting. In most cases it's Donald Trump, so cutting off the mic so that you don't hear what he's saying, and also secondly maybe not using a split screen so you can see his reactions, you can see his interruption. So,
yeah, but then that would be to some extent editorializing the presidential debate by cutting off certain people based on the perception.
Well, it's not editorializing, Charles. Right. The rule is you give someone their 2 minutes and you don't interrupt them.
But let me ask you this. What do you reckon, because I mean we've seen the punters, the Washington Post and all the rest of them, and these are all newspapers that have traditionally been opposed to Donald Trump. What do you reckon US voters will make of this debate? I mean, have any polls surfaced yet?
Well, there are some polls that have surfaced, and they say that it's overwhelmingly, not overwhelmingly, a CBS poll put it at about 60-40, and another poll put it at about 50-45. But what's really interesting, Charles, is the demographics involved. And that demographics I'm talking about are the women. Those are the ones he needs to attract and appeal to. And that's the gender gap that we're talking about.
Right.
And we have some numbers to show you there. If we look at the gender gap, Charles, at this present day, 34 days before the election, Joe Biden has a 31-point lead amongst likely female voters. 31 points, Charles. And in the battleground state of Pennsylvania, which is crucial to a Trump victory, which he won back in 2016, Joe Biden is 23 points ahead. So I guess what I'm suggesting, Charles, if there was ever an opportunity to not only expand his base, but to be more palatable to women, he basically, by his conduct and rhetoric and behavior last night, he squandered that. And so women will become even more alienated as we speak.
And Karl, putting your reality fact-checking hat on, I mean, how did both men fare when it came to being truthful? Did you have quite a lot of facts to check there, or is it difficult to fact-check anything when politicians don't seem to be interested in thoughtful debate?
Well, that's the problem, Charles, because of course there was the usual both sides being economical with the truth, especially when it came to President Trump. I mean, Joe Biden was called out in terms of the decline in violence, comparing Obama to the Trump years. But if anything, that's part of the problem. People could not even concentrate or follow the conversation. There were so many interruptions, and if anything, there was no sense of a dignity of the format or dignity of the office of the presidency. And that's why it was more like a barroom brawl, if you will. And it raised many unanswered questions.
Right. So in that sense, who do you think managed to achieve his objective going into this debate?
Well, don't forget, Charles, going into this, already they maybe made a strategic blunder in saying that in questioning Joe Biden's mental acuity, his physical stamina and fitness, that he's not altogether there upstairs. And maybe he's taking performance-enhancing drugs if he does last a full 90 minutes. Well, in short, the bar was so low in terms of expectations, he met it comfortably. It was not a sterling, stellar performance by Joe Biden, but he weathered the storm. And in doing so, he showed people he could stand up to, quite frankly, was bullying tactics of the president. So in that context, Joe Biden actually came out ahead, looking perhaps more presidential.
Nevertheless, President Trump went into this aiming to turn it into a dogfight. I mean, his objective was to shake up the dynamic of the race. And you have to agree that he did.
Well, yes and no, Charles. And I'll tell you why. This is not 2016. When it was 2016, he had a message. He was talking about immigration. He was talking about trade, losing jobs to China and elsewhere. He was talking about Obamacare. Well, that message has kind of dissolved because he has no health care plan. And he has no foil like Hillary Clinton, who was even more unpopular, shall we say. He had a chant of lock her up, lock her up. None of that happened. He came into this not only without a message, not only without a plan, but also trailing badly. He's losing with 34 days to go, and he's struggling to try to narrow that gap.
Right.
And he didn't do it last night. The point I'm making, which I've made before, every day he spends on the defensive about something is a lost day to showing why he should be given another 4 years in office.
And what was the most difficult political territory, do you think, for President Trump in this debate? Going past the rabble, the rabble-rousing, the shouting, the interruptions, to the issues. Was it the coronavirus or something else?
Coronavirus was part of it, Charles. And I'll tell you, that's where Joe Biden also really distinguished himself. Because when it came to talking about coronavirus, and this is which I really admired about him, once again, Donald Trump was talking about Joe Biden's family. And whenever Joe Biden had a point to make, what he did was this. He barely looked at Donald Trump. He looked into the camera.
Yes, I noticed that.
He was talking to the American people.
I have to say that made him look quite presidential.
And he was saying, I know what it must be like if you have a family and you see an empty chair that next morning because you've lost the coronavirus. That was very poignant. That was very empathetic. That showed he was connecting with the reality of pain of American people. And when Donald Trump was criticizing him about his son Hunter Beau, again, Joe Biden looked into the camera and said, this is not about your family or my family. This is about American families. I think people will remember that. I thought that was impressive.
No, absolutely. And so plenty of heat, but was any new light shed on the candidates, particularly for those who are undecided voters in America?
I don't think many minds were changed, Charles. If anything, both sides are dug in already, and if there was a small portion of undecided, it's much smaller than back in 2016. I think they were perhaps more turned off or alienated by President Trump's behavior. I think even his own allies say that his conduct was too aggressive, was too hot. He needs to really tone it down. But the problem is, these are his three enemies, Charles. His enemy is the coronavirus, which is still spiraling out of control. His enemy is Joe Biden, who's ahead of the polls. And then finally, lastly, Charles, his enemy is time. He's got less than 5 weeks now.
Yes, and that must be a source of concern for the people in his camp. And in terms of the overall reaction to the debate, we've got less than a minute to go. What are you hearing from ordinary Americans?
I think ordinary Americans want someone who can give them information, give them a vision, to give them hope that there's a plan to get out of these crises, multiple crises from health and economy. That didn't happen.
Either from Joe Biden or from the president.
And as I was suggesting, the first debate is the one that people watch the most. And if this is going to be more of the same for the next two, they're not going to tune into it. But however, it may be refreshing to be watching Kamala Harris next week against Vice President Mike Pence. So I actually do look forward to that.
Yes, I look forward to it too. Karl, thank you very much indeed. Karl Bostic, our special correspondent there. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including we hear from an internationally renowned criminologist about how to reform Nigeria's antiquated penal system. Stay with us.